It was the summer of 2002 when I made the worst decision of my life. A decision so grave that even now, more than 2 decades later, the memories haunt me. I was 23, reckless and desperate for a break from the monotony of life. So when my best friend Eric suggested we go on a camping trip deep into the Smoky Mountains, I jumped at the chance. "I know this spot," Eric had said with a grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Secluded, untouched by tourists. No one will bother us." If only I had listened to my gut when it churned uneasily at his words. But I didn't. I wanted to escape, and his promise of serenity sounded perfect. We packed light: tents, sleeping bags, basic supplies, and a map Eric swore he didn't need because he knew the area like the back of his hand. The drive was long but scenic, winding through dense forests and steep cliffs. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. "That's strange," Eric muttered, staring at the trailhead sign. It was weathered, the words barely legible. But what caught my attention was the crude warning scratched into the wood. "Turn back." "Kids messing around," he said dismissively, though his voice lacked confidence. I wanted to argue, to suggest we find another spot. But I didn't want to appear cowardly. So we pressed on. The forest was alive with sounds: the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. But as we ventured deeper, those sounds began to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. "Relax," Eric said, though he was walking faster now, his flashlight beam darting nervously through the trees. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and roots that snagged at our boots. Twice I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but every time I turned there was nothing, just darkness. We stumbled upon it just as night fell, a small dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Its windows were shattered, the door hanging ajar. "Perfect," Eric said, grinning. "Better than pitching a tent." I stared at the cabin, unease curling in my stomach. "I don't know, Eric. It looks abandoned." "Exactly. No one's going to bother us here." Reluctantly, I followed him inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. Rot, maybe. The floorboards creaked under our weight, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room, a space dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Above it hung a faded, grotesque painting of a woman with hollow eyes. Her gaze seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. "Creepy," Eric said, laughing, "but it adds character." I didn't laugh. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Eric groaned. "Go back to sleep. Man, it's probably a branch." But the tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window. Slowly I turned my head, my blood turning to ice. There, on the other side of the broken glass, was a face, pale, gaunt, with eyes so black they seemed to absorb the light. I screamed, scrambling back. Eric was on his feet in an instant, flashlight in hand, but when he shone it at the window, there was nothing there. "You're imagining things," he said, though his voice trembled. I wanted to leave, but Eric insisted we stay. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he said. "We're in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out here." I didn't believe him. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. While gathering wood for a fire, I noticed marks in the dirt around the cabin, drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled through the underbrush. And then I found the bones. They were small, animal-like, but the way they were arranged, stacked neatly in a pile surrounded by a ring of stones, felt deliberate, ritualistic. "Probably coyotes," Eric said when I showed him. But his face was pale, his bravado slipping. That night, the noises began in earnest, scratching at the walls, whispering that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and then the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the cabin. We barricaded the door with a chair, but it did little to ease my terror. Every creak, every groan of the old wood set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., Eric shook me awake. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. I did. A low, guttural growl coming from beneath the floorboards. "There's nothing under there," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself. He grabbed a flashlight and pried up one of the loose boards. The stench that wafted up was overwhelming. Decay, rot, death. "Eric, stop," I said, my voice shaking. But he didn't listen. He reached down, pulling out something that made my stomach churn. A doll. Old, filthy, with a cracked porcelain face and empty eye sockets. "Who keeps something like this?" he muttered, tossing it aside. But as it hit the floor, the whispers began again, louder this time, almost angry. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I insisted we leave. Eric didn't argue. But as we stepped outside, we saw them, symbols carved into the trees, into the dirt, even into the walls of the cabin. They hadn't been there before. It felt like we were being watched, hunted. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. And then we heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling Eric's name. He froze, his face ashen. That's my mother's voice." "No, it's not," I said, grabbing his arm. "We have to go." But he pulled away, stumbling toward the sound. I shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He disappeared into the trees, and I was alone. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed endless, every direction the same. And then I saw it, the figure from the window, standing ahead of me. It smiled, its mouth impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I turned and ran the other way, but no matter where I went, it was there, always ahead of me, always smiling. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was running, the next I was stumbling out of the forest, covered in scratches and mud. Eric was never found. I tried to tell the police, but they didn't believe me. They said I was in shock, that Eric had probably gotten lost. But I know the truth. The cabin is still out there, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers. And I wonder if Eric does too. They say there's a carnival that appears once every few decades. A strange and fleeting spectacle that comes without warning and vanishes without a trace. Most dismiss it as urban legend, but I know it's real. I've seen it, and I wish I hadn't. This happened in 1998, in a small town in Maine where I grew up. I was 17, rebellious, and eager to escape the suffocating boredom of small-town life. That summer, the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. People talked about strange happenings, animals disappearing, Lights in the sky, whispers in the woods. I didn't pay much attention. I should have. It was a humid July night when it appeared. A flyer fluttered into my bedroom through the open window. I picked it up, curious. It was old-fashioned, printed in black ink on yellowed paper. The Silent Carnival, 1 night only, midnight. No tickets, no questions, just fun. There was no address, just a small sketch of a Ferris wheel surrounded by eerie symbols. My first instinct was to toss it, but something about it drew me in. That night I told my best friend, Claire, about it. She laughed, but there was an edge of curiosity in her voice. "Why not check it out?" she said. "It's probably just some weird local thing." I agreed. After all, what else was there to do? We set out around 11:30 p.m., the air cool and thick with fog. The flyer hadn't specified a location, but somehow we knew where to go. It was as if an invisible thread was guiding us, pulling us deeper into the woods on the outskirts of town. When we reached the clearing, my breath caught. The carnival was there, bathed in an otherworldly glow. Strings of dim golden lights crisscrossed the grounds, illuminating a sprawling maze of tents, rides, and booths. The Ferris wheel loomed above it all, its skeletal frame turning slowly, though there was no sound. That was the first thing I noticed, the silence. No laughter, no music, no calls from barkers trying to draw us in. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. "This is weird," Claire whispered, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. Against my better judgment, we stepped inside. The first thing we saw was a carousel. The horses were carved from wood, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. Claire reached out to touch one, and I grabbed her hand. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling. She rolled her eyes. "You're such a buzzkill." As we moved deeper into the carnival, I realized we weren't alone. Shadows flitted between the tents, figures moving just out of sight. Their shapes were wrong. Too tall, too thin, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Whenever I tried to focus on them, they disappeared. We passed a shooting gallery where the targets were lifelike dolls, their painted eyes wide with terror. A ring-toss game featured hoops of bone and stakes, topped with something that looked disturbingly like human skulls. "Let's leave," I said, but Claire was already walking toward the Ferris wheel. It wasn't like any Ferris wheel I'd ever seen. The seats were cages, and as they revolved, I thought I saw people inside, their faces pale and blank. Claire was enchanted. "We have to ride it," she said, dragging me forward. A man stood by the controls, if you could call him that. He was impossibly tall, his face hidden by a tattered hood. When he turned toward us, I saw that he had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to pull the light in. "2 riders," Claire said cheerfully. The man didn't respond, but the cage door swung open. "No," I said, pulling her back, but she shrugged me off. "Don't be such a baby." She climbed in, and before I could stop her, the door slammed shut. The wheel began to turn, faster and faster, until it was a blur of light and shadow. I called out to her, but the silence swallowed my voice. When the wheel finally slowed, Claire was gone. Panic set in. I stumbled through the carnival, calling her name, but all I got in response were whispers, soft, mocking, nonsensical. The shadows were closing in now, their movements deliberate, predatory. I found myself in front of a tent, with a sign that read, "The Hall of Reflections." It was the only place I hadn't searched. Swallowing my fear, I stepped inside. The tent was filled with mirrors, each one warped and distorted. As I moved deeper, the reflections changed. They weren't me anymore. They showed Claire, trapped in the Ferris wheel, her mouth open in a silent scream. Another mirror showed her in the shooting gallery, one of the dolls now, her painted eyes wide with terror. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. Stay, play, join us. I turned to run, but the exit was gone. The mirrors closed in, and for a moment I thought I saw my own reflection staring back at me, grinning with too many teeth. I don't know how I got out. One moment I was in the Hall of Reflections. The next I was stumbling through the woods, the carnival lights fading behind me. I ran until I collapsed, my lungs burning, my heart pounding like a drum. When I reached town, I tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed me. Claire was written off as a runaway, and life went on. I still see her sometimes, in mirrors, in dreams, in the shadows that gather at the edge of my vision. The silent carnival hasn't returned, but I know it will, and when it does, I won't be here to see it. I made a promise to myself, no more bad decisions. But some nights, when the wind carries the faint sound of carnival music, I wonder if I really escaped at all. In the fall of 2015, I was desperate. My mother was in the hospital with mounting medical bills. My job at the local diner wasn't enough to keep us afloat, and eviction notices had become a regular decoration on our front door. So when I got the email, I didn't hesitate. Congratulations, you've been invited to participate in the Watcher's game. 1 night, 1 decision, $1 million if you win. Reply yes to confirm. It sounded like a scam. It had to be. But the sender, anonymous and untraceable, somehow included my full name, birth date, and even my mother's hospital address. It felt personal, targeted. I ignored it at first, but after days of being harassed by debt collectors, I cracked. I typed yes and hit send. I was instructed to arrive at an old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town at exactly 9 p.m. The house had been the subject of rumors for years. Murders, hauntings, cult activity. The locals called it the Blackthorn House and avoided it at all costs. But I didn't care. I needed the money. The mansion loomed against the night sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at me. The front door creaked open as I approached, though no one was there. Inside, I found 6 others, all strangers, standing in an ornate parlor lit by a massive chandelier. They were an odd mix: 2 young women, an elderly man, a couple in their 30s, and a teenager who couldn't have been older than 16. No one spoke much. We were all waiting for answers. At exactly 9:15, the door slammed shut, and a voice crackled over hidden speakers. Welcome to the Watcher's game. Tonight you will face 3 challenges. Survive until dawn, and the prize is yours. Fail, and the house will claim you. The rules are simple. Follow the instructions and never break the rules. Good luck. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, a door had appeared at the far end of the room, leading down to the basement. The voice returned. Your first challenge is trust. Enter the basement, and one of you must retrieve the key from the chest. Only one. The group hesitated. The couple argued in whispers, while the teenager, a wiry boy named Ethan, volunteered. I'll go, he said, puffing out his chest like he had something to prove. We followed him down the creaking stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a maze of corridors, the walls covered in strange symbols that pulsed with faint light. In the center of the room was a chest. When Ethan opened it, he screamed. Inside was a key, but it was buried in a mass of writhing black worms. He hesitated, but the voice returned. The key must be retrieved. Gritting his teeth, Ethan plunged his hand into the chest. When he pulled it out, the worms clung to him, burrowing into his skin. He screamed again, but the key was in his hand. The lights flickered, and Ethan collapsed. His body twitched unnaturally, and his eyes turned black. The voice returned. He broke the rules. The key was meant for another. The worms devoured him completely, leaving only the key behind. No one moved. I finally grabbed it, my hands shaking. The door at the top of the stairs opened and we ran. The parlor was different now, darker, colder. The chandelier swayed as if moved by an unseen wind. The voice returned. Your second challenge is sacrifice. One of you must stay behind. Choose wisely. Panic set in. The couple shouted, accusing each other of cowardice. The elderly man who introduced himself as Frank tried to calm everyone down, but his efforts were in vain. I'll do it, said one of the women, a quiet brunette named Lisa. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. I don't have anyone waiting for me. Before we could argue, the door slammed shut, and she was gone. The rest of us moved to the next room, leaving her behind. As the door closed, I heard her scream, long, agonized, and abruptly silenced. We were now 4, me, Frank, the couple, Mia and Sam. The next room was a dining hall, a long table set with silver platters. The voice returned. Your final challenge is hunger. Eat what is offered and you may leave. Refuse, and you will remain. The platters lifted, revealing plates of raw meat, still dripping with blood. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of iron and decay. Sam refused outright, pushing his plate away. I'm not eating that. Mia tried to convince him, but he wouldn't budge. Frank, however, picked up a piece and ate it without hesitation. His face twisted in pain, but he kept going until his plate was clean. I hesitated, staring at the meat. It twitched as if alive. But I couldn't stay here. I took a bite, gagging as the warm, slimy texture filled my mouth. It tasted of rot and ash, but I forced it down. When I looked up, Mia was eating too, tears streaming down her face. Sam, however, stood his ground. The voice returned. 3 have passed. 1 has failed. The chandelier shattered, and the shadows came alive, dragging Sam into the darkness. His screams echoed as the door opened, leading to the final room. The last room was a library, its shelves filled with books, bound in what looked like human skin. In the center of the room stood a figure in a dark cloak, the Watcher. Its face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on my chest like a heavy weight. Congratulations, it said, its voice hollow and cold. You have survived, but the game is not yet over. It stepped closer, holding out a contract written in blood. One final decision remains. Take the prize, and the game will end for you. But another will take your place. Refuse, and you will leave empty-handed, but the game ends forever. I stared at the contract, my mind racing. If I took the money, someone else would suffer. But if I refused, all this would be for nothing. My mother would die, and I'd lose everything. Frank stepped forward, snatching the contract. I'll do it, he said, signing his name without hesitation. The Watcher laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. So be it. The room dissolved into darkness, and I woke up outside the mansion, clutching a briefcase filled with cash. Frank was gone, and Mia was nowhere to be seen. I used the money to pay off my debts and get my mother the treatment she needed. Life went on, but the nightmares never stopped. A year later, I received another email. The Watcher's Game, one night only, invite a friend. I deleted it, but the feeling never left. Somewhere out there, the Watcher was still playing its game, and I had been a part of it. A year later, I received another email. The Watcher's Game, one night only, invite a friend. I deleted it, but the feeling never left. Somewhere out there, the Watcher was still playing its game, and I had been a part of it.